Hello, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about Evelyn Osborne's adult reflections on a childhood kissing game. The case of King William was King George's son. One of the things I love about this article is that it is, it's a strange opportunity for us to get a really deep description of the kind of childhood play that is more or less gone now. The context is Outport, Newfoundland. She gives thick descriptions of the specific context of Princeton, Newfoundland, and the small Outport community in which this took place in the 1960s, as remembered both using the ethnographic resources of folklorists who had come to Newfoundland at that time, and also the memories of Evelyn's aunt and mother, and their childhood memories, particularly of this game. And I think what it does is it really helps illustrate there's sometimes a tendency for not simply people at large, but also folklorists, to kind of speak of within this nostalgic framework of you can't do this stuff anymore, this has gone, this has disappeared. And one of the things to bear in mind when we're talking about children's folklore is one of the reasons why certain forms have disappeared is that we have been constantly redefining childhood. So this is a kissing game. This is basically, and again, she describes it in a number of different contexts. In the one-room schoolhouse, it tended to be, all the children of the community, and so the play group wasn't stratified by age nearly as much. Children from 7 till 12 might be playing in it. When a two-room schoolhouse came, a slightly larger group, there's a greater self-congregation, and you started to have stratification by age, and the older kids didn't play with the younger kids, and also boys didn't play with the girls, and this became a younger girls game. It's good to sort of get the awkwardness of the binary out of the way now, in large part because we are dealing with fairly religious communities that are very heteronormative and binary focused. So that would be one of the mandates. And another thing to consider when we think about childhood in general and this sort of concept of binary is that binary works well as an initial explanatory model. And I think the idea of categorizing in terms of yes and no and inside and outside functions quite well. The thing is when we are limited to that as its function, once we get past that initial impulse to categorize. So when childhood is sort of obsessed with this binary aspect, but the other aspect of play that's kind of fascinating in childhood is that you have these categories and then you immediately start exploring slippage and how the categories don't express themselves as well. One of the things that we consider, one of the reasons that riddles and jokes, but particularly riddles, are so fascinating to children, and one of the reasons that we kind of inculcate them in children is that we are already introducing the idea that things have double meanings and that you need to think about things metaphorically, and that a thing that it presents itself as one thing can actually be represented as something else. And so it's an introduction to metaphor, it's an introduction to symbol, but it's an introduction to ambiguity. The cultural categorization is precisely that, cultural. It's not necessary. It is not intrinsic. And therefore, it is a product of human understanding, and human understanding is fallible. So, again, a little bit of a diatribe to, not a diatribe, but a little bit of a tangent to sort of flip through this idea of sort of some of the binary stuff that is almost inherently going to be present in this article and in Newfoundland Outport life. going back to the issue about nostalgia, or the sort of the redefinition of childhood. So this is a rural community. The homes didn't have electricity until the 1960s, didn't have plumbing until the 1980s. So how would play have taken place? Mostly it would be through forms of interaction. She doesn't dwell on the issue of poverty or need or want, but one can, reading between the lines, suggest that toys were few and far between. So the imaginative play was largely through action, through embodied action, through games, through joke, through talk, through congregation, as opposed to mediated through objects and mediated through mass-produced objects. That did change ultimately as markets spread and access changed. The other issue is that you have this new dynamic about threat and safety, because a lot of these games were basically done without adult supervision. That because the idea of having to supervise children is was not necessarily on the board. I mean, obviously there was safety concerns, but the idea that the children can more or less take care of themselves allowed for play to happen outside of the confines of the adult eye. And so that created some kind of shift. And again, we can go back to the cliches of like, oh, we were just kicked out of the house, and then you basically, when the streetlights came on, that's when we came home. That's when we got home. That is, on one hand, it is like this dank nostalgia, but on the other hand, it is an example of how, as we define childhood as in part by having additional threats upon it, and therefore needing to be supervised and needing to be maintained as safe in terms of the literal safety of the child, in terms of the constant watchful eye of a responsible adult, and also the metaphorical safety of the child in terms of not exposing them to dangerous ideas, like what might be present in the kissing game. That changes the dynamic. So now we have this context of rural Newfoundland that is being observed and being remembered by two particularly well-suited people. One who went on to get an English degree and a teaching degree, and has thought about childhood, their own childhood, and in terms of their exposure to contemporary students. And another who has who's become a graphic artist, a painter, who uses Newfoundland outport life as part of the inspiration, and so they are reflecting on it in different ways. So very rich sources. And Newfoundland was also oddly positioned, because even though it was still within this high, thick rural context of outport life up until maybe at least the 1970s, and you can argue even later, but you can argue more or less until the cod moratorium happened in the late 80s and early 90s, when that resource economy basically ended. You had this thick field context of culture, of a place that was literally isolated in terms of Isola, an island that did not have the preponderance of influences from much in the way of popular culture and mediated culture. You had radio starting in the 1940s. It was not a completely absent thing, but again, if you don't have electricity, you don't really have much access to radio. Well, so you had this living culture. Well, simultaneously, you had the university that started in 1949, and one of their mandates was studying Newfoundland culture, and early in the 1960s, the beginning of the Folklore department, a Folklore department that was built in large part on the within the context of many other people had already come to Newfoundland for field work, and so this was understood globally almost as a rich context for a certain form of traditional culture. So you have all these 1950s and 60s ethnographic accounts of childhood games. And she talks about childhood games, even though she's using adult sources. She's using her, in addition to the ethnographic sources that she's citing. Um, One of the things that changed in the study of child lore since it started was the thing about child lore, the thing about studying children's folklore, is that we were all children. As much as when the ethnographer goes out into the field and they encounter a different culture, they are aware that the culture that they are encountering is typically somewhat other from them. There's all the discourse on the insider element in field work. We can talk about that and sort of those considerations. But for the most part, you are encountering another, and you are going in on the assumption, if you're properly motivated, you're going in the assumption that you know very little about this culture and you are going to learn about it. And so you actually observe and you actually see these things in context. But since we were all children, we kind of imagine already that we know what it is like to be a child because we have emerged because we had that in our background, not necessarily factoring in that childhood is more than simply a prior stage, an uncivilized stage. Like they're yet to be sort of the childhood is only of interest in terms of adulthood in potency, and children are really only sort of a pre-evolutionary version of adults. And this is basically the nature of field work. When you stop looking at these things as items, and we would do that with child, because the child lore was basically, oh, I remember this from my childhood, and writing it down. And I remember games, and I would write them down. And then when you actually look or actually get these sort of deep descriptions, you realize there's a lot more going on here. You look at them in context, why a song is chosen, or why of all the games that the children know, a particular game is chosen, is a question. And the answer is typically quite intelligent. Strategies in counting out games. And the kissing game could be arguably a counting out game. Maybe it's by chance. Maybe it is by some kind of manipulation of the game rules. In the same way that you can, if you are clever, you can win in a game of one potato, two potato. Or in order to, if you're using that as a way of sorting teams, you can typically choose your team intelligently, and you're doing that with actually some fairly highly advanced mathematics, as Kenneth Goldstein talks about in his Counting Out Strategies article, which involved looking at kids as they actually play. So going back to this article, the idea that the themes of this of the game are without denying what I just said in terms of thinking of childhood as more than just simply like sort of uncivilized adults, the notion that these themes are play, but play encounters with the fundamental themes that they are going to be, that they understand themselves as most likely something that they are going to have to enact in real form as they grow up. So ideas of courtship, ideas of proving a mate, ideas of fate and chance and ill chance and bad fortune that might be present in terms of choosing a mate, when the expectation is that you would be choosing a mate. And so these kissing games, as much as they are playful, and we have to remember that one of the reasons that we engage in fun things is that they are fun. And if you imagine kissing to be fun, and including the sort of the taboo aspect of it, including the sort of the dangerous risk association of it, and certainly knowing that there is an implicit chastity that is put upon children for good reasons, and then the temporary breaking of it and the temporary exposure of things through something as innocent as a kiss. There's a context in what's the idea? It's Actually, this is a really interesting thought I'm just having in terms of comparison. Comparison? That's not a word, but you know what I'm talking about. Gregory Bateson. And he describes things like certain forms of play, like wrestling, like even like sort of contact sports and so on. Violent play, as it were, roughhousing. And he suggests that one of the things about that is, what's the expression he uses? It's the nip that denotes the bite, because he's using the example of like sort of puppies that are playing with each other. The nip that denotes the bite, but does not denote what the bite denotes. And so it is an action that represents a larger action, but does not represent the motivation behind that larger action. So a little sort of wrestling with you is reminiscent of fighting, but it is not a fight that actually implies hostility. And I think the kissing game kind of operates in the same way. It's the kiss, that it's the genteel kiss that denotes the courtship kiss, but does not denote the feelings of under which does not denote the feelings that the courtship kiss denotes. This is not about actual attraction. This is about playing at this thing that might event that sort of almost in a way prepares us for actual attraction. So the idea of play is, I think, key in this. It's interesting that they also the sisters are looking back and trying to incorporate the importance of this. Well, I think they are reflecting on why of all the childhood games that they remember, this is the one that's most important. And Sylvia, her aunt, chose this as something to paint. So in terms of her life as a professional artist, she painted this image. It's in the first page of the article, and why of all the games she chose this one, and she recognized subsequently that this was a good one to paint because strangers would contact her and say, "I remember playing this game. I'm immediately transported back to it." So it has this sort of sense of evocation. So she thinks of it as somehow representative, and immediately representative just through the position of the children, and then presumably the title of the paintings, like immediately evocative, and an almost what the Madeleine is to À la recherche du temps perdu, the arrangement of bodies in the King William game is almost just metonymic of all of Outport life, seemingly. Meanwhile, Evelyn's mother is much more thinking of it as like the persistence of this tune, in that it does provide some kind of English history, and that English history is also not simply a matter of there is a retention of the text and how King William, when he was Prince William, actually visited Newfoundland, and maybe that's a rationale for why the song is present in the Outport. Up in the air. But also that it is about Englishness, and it is not about Americanness. She lists a couple of other, gives the tunes and gives the lyrics to a number of other counting out games and play tunes that the sisters remember. And one of them is clearly American. It's the S&O line, and it has references to Chicago, and all the others are clearly of English provenance. And that is an important identity marker, making that kind of connection with English heritage, at least for the adults, because the thing that Evelyn ultimately leaves us with is, I began this by talking about nostalgia and looking back, and the notion that, well, maybe it's something more than nostalgia. It is this mediating relationship, and that we can look back at these things and remember them not simply through the rosy glasses of reminiscence and, oh, what a more innocent time, even though we might think of those times as more innocent, not necessarily the cultural moment, but certainly and hopefully prior to whatever traumas that we inevitably are exposed to over the course of the accumulated grief that we have. We sometimes look back at the more hazy days of childhood, again, not as a moment of historical ease, but as a moment of personal ease before things got bad. Hopefully, our childhoods are, and hopefully, your childhood is reasonably removed of trauma. But not simply that they took place in this innocent time, but we also can look back and read complexities back into it. Complexities that we might not have realized were there at the time, and yet simultaneously we see that we were working through these issues, that we were engaged in a complicated text, and we didn't realize the complicatedness of that text, the complexity of that text. But, and here's the cool thing, that text, one of the things that might have given it persistence, might have given it prominence in the repertoire of children, is its very complexity itself. That it is problematic, that it does have these issues that are vexing. And so it sticks. And that's one of the interesting things to think about. When childhood play takes place outside of the view of adults, not dissembling the idea that one of the reasons we do it is fun, and not dismissing and not sort of wholeheartedly embracing the idea that all games have to have some kind of function. But what happens? Why does a game stick in a repertoire? Which makes us think of the idea of repertoire to begin with. We have within all of our folk cultures, children's, larger, whatever, we have these items that they are types. They can be brought back into existence, and we choose to bring them back into existence. We can adapt them as circumstances on very practical levels in terms of how many kids are in a room at any given moment, on what happens when culture shifts on a micro scale, and all of a sudden we are segregated by age and we are segregated by sex in terms of the play groups that kind of naturally emerge the larger and larger the groups get. But so we can adapt, but we can still play it. Why are we still doing these things? And the we becomes the fascinating question, because the thing exists within this folk group of children in this tiny community in Newfoundland. And children are introduced to it by other children. Adults aren't teaching these games. And they keep it going, and those children age out and the other children move in, and they become the elders in that group. We might not think of elders it might be a strange term to use, to think of like a 9-year-old as an elder, but certainly to a 5 or 6-year-old, yes, and a 12-year-old, my goodness, what wisdom they must have to a 7-year-old. And so the persistence of an item through time, perpetuated by the interests and the determination, the ongoing determination, each and every iteration of it is fundamentally a reaffirmation that this text has some kind of relevance to the group that is performing it. So let's play this game. And again, fun. It's running around, it's screaming, it's singing, it's kissing, all things that are fun, but of all the ways to run around and scream and kiss and sing, and why this one has this persistence over time, and then stuck, not as a practice, but as an idea, stuck in the minds of not simply her mother and her aunt, but seemingly many people, at least as reflected in the comments that the painting engendered. So realizing that there's something in this text that is an identity marker. It's an identity marker of English heritage, perhaps. It's an identity marker of Outport life, yes. And it is an introduction, again, that nip that denotes the bite, to something that is going to most likely have some kind of resonance within a rural community. So we have this, the great thing about the article is that it is made present to us because it is in the not so distant past. And so it can be remembered, and remembered critically, fondly, but critically. And both can go hand in hand. As a way of considering that there are aesthetics, there are issues, there are concerns, there are ways of navigating themselves in the world that that children are not actively engaged with, but in some ways are actively preparing for, because they see the world as it has been, as is being presented to them, and through the aspect of play, they are trying to develop the skills in order to engage them. And play allows that. The thing about play is that it's an arbitrary set of rules that attracts attention to its arbitrariness. You're not allowed to touch the ball with your hands. You're not allowed to touch the floor because it's made of lava. But within that set of restrictions, we are allowed to exercise a certain amount of creativity. But at the same time knowing that it is bounded by a kind of harmlessness, because it is only play, because it is seen as a performance and as a frame, and that the kissing in the game does not necessarily denote the kissing outside of that play frame, and doesn't mean that the kissing can't be fun. It just means that the kissing does not suggest something else. So in that, you can't, kids can't play this sort of thing anymore, or kids wouldn't be interested in playing this thing anymore. There's that kind of ebb and flow of both the, as parent, as a hard-nosed nostalgic, and but even as folklorist, this sense that the definition of childhood has changed, in large part because of our ever-increasing concern about the safety and the sanctity and the removal of potential threat or trauma or upset from children, which is not a bad motivation, but maybe, and this is where I start getting grumpy old man, maybe it is eliminating a very rich source of ways of coping with those same potential traumas, ways of coping and ways of preparing for those same potential traumas that generations of children had developed performances to do. And that if you think of these games as having these themes, that they are fundamentally little performances that allow one to engage in these themes that are still seen as only performative, only play, only game. I'm getting to a point. It's just that I'm thinking about it as we go. And that doesn't mean that we need to think of these texts as, we don't need to overly concern ourselves with the longevity of these texts, because that doesn't mean that it's only when we are playing this one particular game that this theme is going in, because clearly there are other kissing games. But it's not too much of a conjecture, knowing what we know about repertoire, knowing what we know about the dynamics of group, that however this game entered into the group, it was seen as appropriate in part because it does deal with these particular concerns. It's not too much of an imaginative idea to suggest that children's culture is very, very old. And it's not that children's culture is very, very old because we see these older forms in it. But children's culture has always been there because children have always been there. Living within a world that is dominated by adults, living in a world that is dominated by having, even in this free, seemingly free context of outport life and the liberties that were afforded children, still clearly within the confines of an adult world where there are strictures placed upon them, and they have, and that has always been because children have always existed. And intelligent people develop these repertoires for engaging with this group that is largely defined by these binary opposites about liberty and not liberty. I am a child, I have restrictions, and adults, and I am going to be eventually going to become an adult. It's not that strange to start with this consideration. Then remember how many of our fairy tales, how many of our Märchen are about children becoming adults. They're about adolescence. They're about the preparatory stage. So, and these are stories that are largely told to children. And are largely told by adults, no less. But they're all about going from this stage of almost ill-preparedness to preparedness. And so they're all about fumbling towards this. Now, children's culture itself has its own set of repertoire for engaging in this thing. And those generations leave, and then childhood basically ends, and those become adults, and they might forget that they had these forms that were actually addressing something quite dynamic and complicated. They might only remember the forms. And so, so they'll remember the text of King George, of King William. They'll remember the moves. They'll remember, and they'll remember it fondly. But they might not, and I think the sisters have this additional level of insight. They might not think that what you have is this whole complexity of texts that emerge because they aptly and aesthetically pleasingly also help to negotiate these themes that are present within childhood. Yeah, that's it. So this can pluck out. I mean, you know, the history of this particular text is important, is relevant, but presumably well before King William was even born, well before this text was written, there was another thing in the active repertoire of children, of the ancestors of these children, that did something similar, because the group of children get together and they're like basically helping to self-enculturate. I think that's a term that Evelyn cites, in that it is not about child lore is not about the things that adults teach children. There is a whole interesting realm of the stuff that we teach to children. But the really interesting thing about child lore is the stuff that older kids teach to younger kids. And it's like, this is what you're going to kind of have to know. They don't do it through direct instruction. They do it through game and play. Kind of a fascinating area. So, I got excited because I like exciting articles. And the exciting article that I have talked about today is Evelyn Osborne's Adult Reflections on a Childhood Kissing Game. The Case of King William Was King George's Son. As ever, my friends, I wish you nothing but the best. My name is Ian, and I will see you later. Bye-bye.